She signed the paper with a shaking hand, and the entire town watched her do it. Evelyn Cross was 26 years old when a cattle syndicate took everything her father had built: the land, the cattle, the deed, and the only future she had ever known. They did it legally. They did it in broad daylight, and not one person in Aldermore said a word to stop them. She wasn't weak. She wasn't stupid. She was trapped by debt, by grief, and by men who had been stealing from people like her for years and winning every single time. This is the story of what happened when she decided they wouldn't win again. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The morning it all fell apart started ordinary enough, which was the cruelest part. Evelyn Cross was up before sunrise the way she always was, pulling on her boots in the dark, her hands moving from habit because her mind was somewhere else entirely. She'd barely slept. The letter from Harlan Briggs's land office had arrived 3 days earlier, and she'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. She told herself she'd find a way out. She told herself there was always a way out. She told herself a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. The Cross homestead sat 11 miles outside the town of Aldermore, a spread of just under 200 acres that her father, Thomas Cross, had broken from raw prairie 15 years ago. Not good land, not the kind men fought wars over. Rocky in the southeast quarter, dry in summer, prone to flooding along the creek bed every spring. But Thomas Cross had worked it like it owed him something, and slowly, stubbornly, it had started to give. By the time Evelyn was 12, they had cattle. By the time she was 16, they had a reputation. Small, but clean. A cross deed meant something. Then Thomas Cross got sick. Not fast sick, not the kind that kills you before you have time to think. Slow sick. The grinding, expensive, humiliating kind that empties a bank account the same way water empties a bucket with a hole in it. You keep thinking there's still enough, right up until there isn't. He died 14 months ago, in the second week of March, with the ground still frozen and the mortgage still not paid. Evelyn had not cried at the funeral. She'd stood at the grave with her hands folded and her jaw set, and she had thought very clearly, there's still time, there's still a way. She had his stubbornness, if not his name. She was going to work the land. She was going to pay off the debt. She was going to keep what was theirs. She had not counted on Harlan Briggs. Briggs was not from Aldermore. He'd shown up about 3 years back, trailing money and lawyers and a kind of easy confidence that made men nervous and made women trust him, which was exactly backwards from how it should have worked. He was maybe 50, built like a man who'd once been strong and had since decided that wasn't necessary anymore. Soft in the jaw, thick in the middle, with pale eyes that moved fast in a face that stayed very still. He ran something called the Consolidated Range Syndicate, which was a long name for a simple operation. Buy up struggling homesteads, consolidate grazing rights, run cattle across land that used to belong to a dozen different families, and sell the beef at scale. Legal, organized. And underneath all of it, mean in the particular way that paperwork can be mean, which is the worst kind because there's nothing to punch. He'd sent a man to the Cross place 2 months after Thomas died. Friendly man, well-dressed, hat in hand, full of sympathies. He sat at Evelyn's kitchen table and drank her coffee and explained that her father's remaining debt had been purchased by the Consolidated Range Syndicate and that they were prepared to work with her toward resolution. Evelyn had asked what resolution meant. The man had smiled, not unkindly, which she found somehow worse, and explained that the syndicate was willing to extend the loan terms in exchange for a performance agreement. She would continue operating the ranch under a provisional management contract. If she met certain productivity benchmarks over the next 12 months, the debt would be forgiven and the title would transfer cleanly to her name. What benchmarks? She'd asked. He'd slid a paper across the table. She'd read it. Then she'd read it again. The benchmarks were impossible, not difficult. Impossible. Headcounts she couldn't reach, yield figures that assumed twice the acreage she had, delivery windows that required equipment she didn't own. But it was all written in language that sounded reasonable, full of words like industry standard and market adjustment and good faith compliance. And she'd been awake for 36 hours, and her father was 3 weeks in the ground, and the lawyer she'd have needed to untangle it all was 60 miles away in Dunmore City. She'd signed it. She'd spent the 11 months since working herself half to death, trying to meet numbers that were designed to make her fail. The letter that arrived 3 days ago was the formal notice of default. She had known it was coming. That didn't make it land any softer. She read it standing in the yard, still holding the mail satchel, with the morning quiet around her and the cattle moving slow in the far pasture, not knowing yet that none of this was going to be theirs much longer. The letter informed her that pursuant to Section 7 of the Provisional Management Agreement, failure to meet benchmarks as outlined constituted grounds for full asset liquidation. A syndicate representative would arrive in Aldermore on the 14th to facilitate transfer of all deeds, titles, and livestock to the Consolidated Range Syndicate. The 14th was today. She'd saddled her horse and ridden into town before she'd even decided what she was going to do when she got there. Aldermore in the early morning looked like a town that had agreed to stay small and was mostly okay with that. One main street, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without drama, lined with the usual architecture of frontier practicality. The general store, the feed barn, the telegraph office, a barber shop that also functioned as something like a town hall when the need arose. The Sandhill Inn sat at the north end of the street, and it was outside the inn that 2 men in clean coats were already waiting when Evelyn arrived. She recognized one of them. The same man who'd sat at her table 11 months ago, drunk her coffee, smiled her father's debt into her hands. The other was new. Younger, with the flat expression of a man who'd been hired specifically to stand behind other men and make them feel safer. There were others too. The local land office manager, a nervous little man named Purdy who could never quite look at anything directly. 2 men she didn't recognize sitting on a bench outside the telegraph office, watching with the careful attention of people who'd been told to watch. And just down the street, in clusters of 2 and 3, some of the townspeople, ranchers, shopkeepers, a woman Evelyn recognized from church a few years back. Nobody had come to help her. They'd come to see what happened. She hated them for it. Then she reminded herself she didn't have the energy to hate anyone right now and let it go. She dismounted, tied her horse to the post, and walked toward the 2 men in clean coats with her back straight and her hands loose at her sides. "Miss Cross?" the familiar man said. Cordell was his name. James Cordell. She'd had plenty of time over the past year to remember it. "I hope you got our letter." "I got it," she said. "Good. Then you understand what today is." "I understand what you're calling it." She stopped a few feet from him. Up close, he looked tired, which surprised her. Like this was something he'd done enough times that it had started to cost him something. And he didn't quite like that, but didn't know what to do about it either. She wasn't about to feel sorry for him. "I want to speak with someone who can actually make a decision. Not you." Cordell blinked. "I am authorized to—" "You're authorized to process paperwork. I want the man who signs the paperwork. I want to speak with Briggs." There was a small silence. "Mr. Briggs doesn't typically—" "I'm not asking what he typically does." Cordell and the younger man exchanged a look. The younger man moved his coat slightly, the way men do when they want you to see what's under it. Evelyn saw it and looked back at Cordell without reacting. "Mr. Briggs is at the auction grounds," Cordell said, after a moment. He wasn't expecting this to require his personal attention. "Then he'll be surprised," Evelyn said. "Is there a document that requires my signature today?" "There is." "Then I suggest you tell him he needs to be present when I sign it, because I am not signing anything without looking that man in the eye." Well, Harlan Briggs arrived 20 minutes later, which told her something about how much he'd expected trouble from her. He was dressed for the auction, not for a confrontation. Good coat, clean boots, hair oiled back. He walked toward her with the kind of measured ease that powerful men cultivate because it reminds people that they don't have to hurry. The world waits for them, waits for. He stopped a few feet from her and looked her over in that quick cataloging way. She'd seen men do it her entire life, measuring her, deciding she didn't matter much. "Miss Cross," he said, his voice was pleasant. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances." "I'm sure," she said. "I want to talk about the contract." There's not much to talk about. The terms were clear. The terms were designed to fail. Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, but close. "I'd push back on that characterization. Push back all you want. I can read numbers, Mr. Briggs. The yield targets in that agreement assumed I had access to the southern water rights I didn't have. They assumed I could afford to hire seasonal workers on wages I couldn't afford. They assumed a headcount that would have required me to buy 40 additional cattle with money I didn't have, from a market you happen to control." She paused. Those benchmarks weren't meant to be met. They were meant to be missed. Briggs looked at her for a moment. The pleasant expression didn't quite disappear, but something underneath it got a little colder. The agreement was reviewed by legal counsel, he said. Who's legal counsel? He didn't answer that. My father's debt, she said. The original debt. What was the actual balance when you purchased it? I'm not sure that's $1,140, she said. I found the original note, and the interest rate your office applied when it transferred to the syndicate was nearly double the original terms. That's not legal. I don't think you're operating within the law, Mr. Briggs, and I think you know that, and I think that's why your man Cordell looks like he hasn't slept since February. Cordell, standing slightly to Briggs's left, did not visibly react, but his ears went red. Briggs was quiet for a moment. The people on the street had drifted closer without quite seeming to. Purdy from the land office had a piece of paper he kept pretending to need to check. Miss Cross, Briggs said, and his voice had dropped just slightly, the pleasantness more deliberate now, something being held in position rather than naturally present. I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Where are you going to go with that argument? There's no lawyer in Aldermore. The circuit judge comes through twice a year. The territorial court in Dunmore City costs more to file in than you have. And every day you spend arguing, the interest on the remaining debt continues to accumulate. He tilted his head slightly. What exactly is your play here? She had been afraid of that question for 3 days. She didn't have a good answer to it. She had come here because she'd had to come here, because doing nothing felt like dying standing up. But she hadn't come with a plan. Sign the document, he said quietly. Take the relocation allowance. It's more than fair. Start somewhere new. This is my land, she said. It was your father's land, he said, and now it's going to be mine. She signed the document. She didn't know what else to do. Cordell slid it across a small folding table they'd set up outside, and she stood in the street in front of half of Aldermore, and she put her name on the paper that gave the Consolidated Range Syndicate control of the Cross homestead, all livestock, and all associated grazing rights. Her hand was shaking and she couldn't make it stop, which was humiliating, but she kept writing until the signature was done. She stepped back. The paper went into Cordell's case, and that was that. The crowd that had gathered didn't disperse immediately. They stood around in that uncomfortable way people stand when they've witnessed something bad and haven't quite decided how to feel about it. A few of them made eye contact with her and then found reasons to look somewhere else. Old Marcus Webb, who ran the feed store and had known Thomas Cross for 20 years, opened his mouth and then closed it. Nobody said anything. Briggs was already talking quietly with Cordell, already moving on. She was already finished as far as he was concerned. She walked back to her horse. She didn't run. She wouldn't give them that. She didn't leave town. She wasn't sure why. There was nothing to stay for. The relocation allowance, $40, which was an insult wearing the costume of generosity, was in her coat pocket. She had nowhere specific to be. But she tied her horse outside the Sandhill Inn and went inside and sat at a corner table and ordered coffee. And she sat with it going cold in front of her while the morning moved past the window and the street went back to its ordinary business, as if a woman hadn't just lost everything on it 20 minutes ago. The inn was nearly empty at this hour. Margaret Hollis, who ran it, brought the coffee without being asked for a refill and set it down without saying anything, which was the most kindness Evelyn had received all morning. She stared at the table and tried to think. There was the argument about the interest rate. She genuinely believed she was right about that. The original note her father had signed with the Dunmore Bank had clear terms, and what the syndicate had applied was different. But arguing it meant a lawyer, and a lawyer meant money, and money was the exact thing she didn't have. She could write letters. She could go to the territorial land office in Dunmore City herself, 40 miles on horseback, and file a complaint with whoever accepted complaints. She had no idea how long that would take or whether it would do anything. She could ask for help. She almost laughed at that. Who exactly? The townspeople who had stood on the street this morning and watched in silence? Marcus Webb, who'd opened his mouth and thought better of it? The sheriff, Ben Holcroft, who'd been conspicuously absent this morning and who everyone in Aldermore knew had a cordial relationship with Briggs's operation? She was 26 years old and her father was dead, and she had $40, and she did not know what to do. She drank the cold coffee because she'd paid for it. She heard him before she saw him. Not the man himself, but the reaction to him. A shift in the noise outside, a cluster of voices that sounded surprised rather than conversational. She looked up at the window and saw a rider coming down the main street at an unhurried walk, on a dark red roan that moved like it had opinions about where it put its feet. The rider was tall, lean in that particular frontier way. Not thin, but economical. Like a man who'd had exactly what he needed for a long time and hadn't wasted any of it. He wore a trail coat that had seen hard use and a hat that sat low enough to keep the sun off most of his face. She didn't know him. She could tell from the way the street responded that other people did. A group of men outside the barbershop went quiet. Two of them stepped back slightly. Not from the horse, from the rider. A woman grabbed her child's shoulder and pulled him close without the child understanding why. Purdy from the land office, who was still out front shuffling his papers, saw the rider coming and suddenly found a reason to go inside very quickly. Even Briggs's man, the one who'd moved his coat earlier, straightened up and put his hand somewhere near where his weapon would be, and then very deliberately moved his hand somewhere else, as if he'd thought better of it. Evelyn turned to Margaret Hollis, who was wiping down the bar with suddenly concentrated attention. "Who is that?" Evelyn asked. Margaret didn't look up immediately. When she did, her expression was the careful sort. Not frightened exactly, but assessed. "Colt Maddox," she said. Evelyn watched him ride. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He was just riding, but she could feel the change in the air the way you feel a weather shift before the clouds arrive. "Should I know that name?" she asked. "Most people out this way do," Margaret said. "He doesn't come through often. Last time he was in Aldermore was 2, maybe 3 years back." She paused. "There was trouble with an outfit running stolen cattle through the eastern ridge. Bunch of men, well armed. Maddox came through, and then there wasn't trouble anymore. He dealt with them." "Dealt isn't quite the word I'd use," Margaret said. "More like he went out there and explained to them very directly what their options were, and they made a choice, and then they left." She set the cloth down. "He didn't kill anybody that time. He doesn't always, though he has. He's not a gun for hire exactly. I don't know what you'd call him." She looked at Evelyn carefully. "What made you ask?" Evelyn looked back out the window. Colt Maddox had stopped his horse in the middle of the street. He was looking at the folding table that Cordell was still in the process of folding. He was looking at Briggs, who had glanced over with the careful stillness of a man who'd noticed a snake and was deciding whether it was the venomous kind. "Just curious," she said. She watched through the window as Maddox dismounted and tied his horse and walked toward the Sandhill Inn without hurrying. He came through the door, and the room felt smaller immediately, not because of his size, but because of the kind of attention he brought with him. A quietness, an awareness of space that made other people unconsciously adjust. He went to the bar, asked Margaret for something to eat, and sat on a stool with his back not quite to the room. He'd positioned himself where he could see the door without making a thing of it. Evelyn looked back at her coffee. She wasn't sure why she'd kept watching. He wasn't her business. Nothing in this town was her business anymore, technically. "You're the cross girl." She looked up. He was watching her from the bar. Not intrusively, just directly. The way some people look at things they're trying to understand. "Woman," she said automatically. He accepted that without comment. "Saw you out front earlier, with Briggs. Half the town saw me." "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "You signed something?" She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure why she'd talked to a stranger about this before she'd talked to anyone else. But something about the question, the lack of pity in it, the absence of the careful, slightly patronizing concern she'd been getting from people for 14 months, made it easier. "I signed something," she said. "My ranch. What was left of my father's estate." He nodded once, slowly. "That the consolidated range operation?" She looked at him more carefully. "You know it?" "Know of it." He turned back to the bar as Margaret set down a plate. He ate for a moment without speaking. Then, "You want to tell me what happened?" "Why?" "Because you're sitting here instead of leaving," he said, "which means you're still working on something. And I've been looking into Briggs's operation for about 6 months, so whatever you know might be useful." She stared at him. "You've been looking into it," she said. Why?" He ate another bite. He didn't seem to be in any hurry. "Because 3 families I know of over in Cutter's Pass went through the same thing your family did. Lost their places to the syndicate inside of a year, all through the same process. Debt bought out, contract signed, benchmarks missed, land transferred. 2 of those families left the territory entirely. One of them," he paused. "One of them, the husband took it hard." He didn't finish that sentence. She understood what he meant. "And you decided to do something about it," she said. "I decided to look into it," he said. "Doing something about it requires knowing what there is to do." He glanced at her sideways. "What was the original debt on your property?" $1,140 to the Dunmore City Bank, standard mortgage terms. "And the syndicate's rate when they took it over?" "I think it was close to double." He nodded again, as if that matched something he already knew. "And the benchmarks? The yield figures in the management contract?" "Impossible to reach. I think deliberately." She paused. "The South Water rights? I never had them." The contract listed them as an assumed resource. He set his fork down and turned to look at her directly. He had a face that was difficult to read in the conventional sense. Not closed exactly, but controlled. Like a man who'd learned to keep his reactions internal because external ones had cost him in the past. "Miss Cross," he said, "do you know where your father's original mortgage documents are?" "Yes," she said. "I have them at the house. Or what used to be the house." She thought about that. The syndicate had formal claim to the property now, but the physical transfer wouldn't happen immediately. Briggs would send men out in the next day or 2 to begin inventory. She had until then. "I have time to get them." "You should," he said. "And anything else in your father's papers that relates to the debt, the land office, or any communication with the syndicate's agents? Any receipts? Any letters? Any records of payment?" He picked his fork back up. "All of it." "What are you planning?" she asked. "I'm not planning anything yet," he said. "I'm gathering information. Planning requires information." He ate for a moment. "If the interest rate they applied was usurious, that's a legal argument that doesn't require a circuit judge. It can go to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office, and there's been a new man in that office in Dunmore since January who has a reputation for not being in anyone's pocket." Evelyn sat back slightly. It was the first specific, useful thing anyone had said to her in 3 days. "You know a lot about property law for a cowboy," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. The expression was more like the shadow of a smile, the place where one could have been. "I know enough to be useful sometimes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked out the window at the street, where Briggs's men were loading the folding table into a wagon, and Briggs himself was heading toward the auction grounds, unhurried and satisfied. "If you go after Briggs," she said, "you become a target." "I'm aware of that. He controls the sheriff's office here, probably has relationships with the courts." "Probably." He didn't sound particularly troubled by it. The last person who tried to make trouble for him, a rancher named Dells over in the East Quarter, had his fences cut and his cattle scattered, and then he had an accident with his wagon that broke his arm in 2 places, and after that he left. "I heard about Dells," Maddox said. He was quiet for a moment. "That kind of thing doesn't work on me the same way it works on most people." She wasn't sure if that was arrogance or just fact. Looking at him, she thought it was probably just fact. "Why are you telling me all this?" she asked. "You don't know me." He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "Because you're the one who just signed the paper," he said, "which means you're the one with standing to make the legal argument. I can help gather information. I can push back against Briggs's operation. I can make life difficult for his people when they step out of legal bounds. But it's your name on the deed, your father's debt, your contract." He looked at her steadily. "This only works if you're part of it." Outside, 2 of Briggs's hired men walked past the inn window. One of them glanced in and kept walking. "I need to go to the house," Evelyn said, "before his people get there." "I'll ride out with you." She opened her mouth to say she didn't need that. Then she thought about the hired men. Then she thought about who was sitting across from her and what Margaret Hollis had said, and the way every person on the street had shifted when that roan horse came into view. "All right," she said. They rode out together in the early afternoon, not talking much. The road to the cross place was familiar to her in the way only the paths of childhood are. Every rut and turn carrying its own separate memory. She'd ridden this way with her father 1,000 times, coming back from town with feed sacks balanced across the back of his horse, him talking, her listening, the land opening up around them as the town fell away. It felt different now. Not the land. The land was exactly the same, indifferent and enormous and more beautiful than it deserved to be. What felt different was her relationship to it. When something belongs to you, you see it with a particular quality of ownership, a sense that the details of it are yours to care about. Now the sage flats and the rocky creek bed and the far line of the ridge were just scenery again, the way they'd been before Thomas Cross had worked them into something. She was not going to think about that right now. Maddox rode beside her without filling the silence with unnecessary words, which she appreciated. She'd had plenty of people fill silences with words in the past 14 months. Most of what they'd said amounted to variations of, "I'm sorry," and "you'll figure something out," which were the two most useless sentences in the English language when they weren't backed by anything practical. He was looking at the land as they rode, and she got the sense he was reading it, noting distances and sight lines and fences in the way of someone for whom landscape was information rather than scenery. "How long has the syndicate been operating in this territory?" she asked. "About 4 years, as near as I can figure," he said. "They came in from the east, started in Cutter's Pass, then worked south and west. Briggs is not the owner, he's an operator." He glanced at her. "You know who the money is behind him?" She shook her head. "I don't either," he admitted. "Not yet. There are names in the syndicate's filings at the territorial registry that might be holding companies, might be investors, might be both. I've been trying to trace them." His jaw tightened slightly. "It's like pulling on a thread that keeps going. That's why you haven't moved on it yet," she said. "You need the full picture. Can't cut the head off if you don't know where the head is," he said simply. The homestead came into view around a bend in the road. The house first, low and solidly built, then the barn, then the small shed where Thomas had kept his tools. All of it exactly as it had been this morning when she'd ridden away from it, knowing in her bones she wasn't coming back as its owner. She pulled up and sat for a moment, looking at it. "You all right?" Maddox asked. "No," she said, "but that's not the relevant question." She clicked her horse forward. The papers were where she'd kept them, in the tin box under the floorboard of the bedroom, which her father had installed himself and been insufferably proud of, as if he'd invented the concept of hidden storage. She'd added to it over the past year. The original mortgage documents, her father's correspondence with the Dunmore Bank, the management contract she'd signed 11 months ago, receipts and records of every payment she'd made toward the debt, and 3 letters she'd sent to the syndicate's office and never gotten responses to. She pulled everything out and laid it on the kitchen table and went through it with Maddox standing to one side, reading what she handed him without comment for a while. He paused at the interest rate calculation. She watched his face. "This is worse than I thought," he said. "Is it usable?" "I think so. I need to compare it to the territorial lending statutes, but if the cap is what I think it is," he set the paper down. "The rate they applied is nearly 3 times the legal limit." She felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something more careful than hope, but in the same direction. "What happens if we can prove that?" she asked. "The original debt becomes void," he said, "which means the management contract, which was contingent on a valid debt, is also void." He looked at her. "Which means the transfer is void." She stood very still. "That doesn't mean it's easy," he said quickly, because he seemed to understand that she needed that counterweight. "Briggs will fight it. He has legal resources. The syndicate's lawyers are better than whatever we'd have access to. And even with a sympathetic land commissioner, these things take time, months, maybe longer." "But it's possible," she said. "It's possible." She started gathering the papers back into the tin box. Outside, she heard horses. Maddox moved to the window before she did, standing to the side of the frame in the particular way of someone who didn't want to be visible while still seeing out. 3 riders, he said. Syndicate's men. 2 of the ones from town, and 1 I don't recognize. "They're faster than I expected," she said. "They were probably watching you leave." She thought about that. About the man outside the barber shop who'd straightened up when Maddox rode in. About the way Briggs had looked at them as they walked past. "They'll say I'm on syndicate property," she said. "Trespassing. That's what they'll say, yeah." He moved away from the window. "Get the box. All of it." A pause. "Is there anything else in this house you need? Anything that can't be replaced?" She looked around the kitchen. Her mother's quilts were in the chest in the bedroom. A photograph. Her father's pipe, which she'd kept on the mantel even though she had no use for it. 2 minutes, she said. "You have 2 minutes," he said, and went to the front door. She heard his voice outside. Easy, not loud, not aggressive. "Can I help you, boys?" The tone of a man who was not concerned but was choosing to be polite about it anyway, which she'd come to understand in the past few hours, was one of the more effective threatening sounds a person could make. She moved quickly through the bedroom, the quilts into a saddlebag, the photograph folded into her coat pocket, the pipe. She hesitated, picked it up, set it down. She picked it up again and put it in her pocket with the photograph. She came back through to the kitchen with the tin box under her arm and stopped. One of the riders had come inside. He was a big man, broad in the chest, with the look of someone hired specifically to be big in chests and stand in rooms uninvited. He was looking at her with an expression that was trying to be official and landing somewhere closer to contemptuous. "Miss Cross," he said, "this property is under syndicate authority as of this morning. You need to vacate." "I'm aware of the situation," she said. "I'm taking personal effects. That's not covered by the deed transfer. I'll need you to leave what's in that box. This box contains my father's personal correspondence and private documents, none of which transferred under the deed." He took a step toward her. From the doorway, Maddox said, "I'd stay where you are." He hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. Something in the sound of it, the absolute absence of uncertainty, stopped the man mid-step as effectively as a physical barrier. The big man looked at Maddox. A long moment passed, the kind where men are running rapid calculations about odds and outcomes. "The property," he started. "The deed covers the land and structures and livestock," Maddox said. "It doesn't cover personal property. You know that. She knows that. This doesn't need to go anywhere except her out the door with her belongings and us all having a fine afternoon." He paused. "What's in the box doesn't matter to your employer." Another long moment. The big man stepped back. Evelyn walked past him, out through the front door, past the 2 remaining riders, one of whom she recognized as someone who avoided Maddox's gaze with the focused determination of a man trying to seem like he wasn't doing that, and went to her horse. Maddox came out a moment later. He mounted without hurrying. They rode away from the house without looking back. At least, she told herself she wasn't going to look back, and she managed it until the first bend in the road, when she looked back despite herself. The house was already small in the distance. The syndicate's men were standing in the yard watching them go. She turned forward and kept riding. "Thank you," she said after a while. "You handled it," he said. "I just stood in a doorway." She thought about that. She thought about the document in Cordell's case with her name on it in shaking letters. She thought about Briggs's voice, flat and reasonable. "It was your father's land, and now it's going to be mine." She thought about 3 times the legal lending rate, written in black ink in her father's mortgage records, waiting to be used. "What happens next?" she asked. Maddox was quiet for a moment, looking at the road ahead. "We figure out what we've got," he said. "Then we figure out who else has been through the same thing. And then—" He paused. "Then we make noise." The sun was moving toward the western ridge. The light was going gold. Somewhere behind them, on land that had been cross-land for 15 years, Briggs's men were walking through her father's house, taking inventory of what was now, legally, theirs. Evelyn Cross had $40 in her coat pocket, a tin box of papers under her arm, her mother's quilts, a photograph, and a pipe that smelled faintly of the man she was still grieving. She also had something she hadn't had this morning. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't a victory. It was smaller than both of those things. She had a direction. For now, that would have to be enough. They made camp that night 3 miles east of Aldermore, on a flat bench above a dry creek bed where the ground was hard and the wind came in low from the north. It wasn't comfortable. Evelyn didn't care about comfortable. She cared about not being visible from the road, and this spot gave them that. Maddox built a fire small enough to be useful without being stupid, and she sat across from it with her coat pulled close and the tin box in her lap and tried to think through what she actually had. The papers were spread between them: mortgage documents, the syndicate contract, her letters, the syndicate's responses, which were 3 in number and said nothing in the particular way of legal correspondence designed to say nothing. "This one," Maddox said. He was holding the original mortgage note from the Dunmore Bank, tilted toward the firelight. "The rate listed here is 7% per annum. That's what my father agreed to," she said. "And the syndicate's transfer document," he set down the first paper and picked up another, "lists the assumed rate as 19.5%. "I did the math 3 times," she said. "I thought I was reading it wrong." "You weren't." He set the paper down. "Territorial statutes cap private debt transfers at 10%. I'd need to check the exact language, but I've seen this argument made in Cutter's Pass and it held. The question is whether the commissioner's office will move fast enough to freeze the property transfer before Briggs's people move assets." "How fast could we get to Dunmore City?" "Hard riding, 2 days?" She did the arithmetic on that. 2 days out, however long at the commissioner's office, 2 days back. Briggs's men would have had the ranch inventoried and reassigned inside that window with room to spare. "He'll strip the place before we get back," she said. "Probably, but if we can get the transfer frozen, the assets have to be returned. It's slower, but it holds." He looked at her across the fire. "There's also another option." She waited. "I told you about the families in Cutter's Pass," he said. 3 of them went through this. There are others I've heard of but not spoken to directly, over in the Garnet Valley area, and some north of here along the Red Rock Corridor. If the same contract structure was used across all of them, we're not talking about a single fraudulent deal. We're talking about a pattern. And a pattern is harder to explain away, she said. "A pattern is almost impossible to explain away," he said. "Especially if it goes in front of the territorial legislature rather than just the land commissioner. That's a different level of attention." She looked at the fire for a moment. The wood was dry and it burned clean, barely any smoke. Her father had taught her how to select wood for a fire like that, how to read it, what to look for. She still caught herself doing it automatically, which felt like a small wound every time. "You said you've been looking into this for 6 months, she said. "About that." "Why?" She looked at him directly. "You said the families in Cutter's Pass. How did you know them?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. She was learning to read the difference. He was someone who paused before answering certain questions, not because he was hiding something, but because he wanted to answer accurately. "The man who took it hardest," he said finally. "His name was Garrett Finch. He had 2 kids and a wife and a place he'd built over 8 years. When the syndicate took it, Another pause. "He didn't handle it the way you're handling it." "You knew him well," she said. It wasn't a question. "He was my cousin," Maddox said. "Distant, but we'd ridden together some years back. I heard what happened to his place and I rode out to Cutter's Pass to see him." He stopped. "He was in bad shape by the time I got there. His family had already left. Wife took the kids to her sister's in Millhaven. He was just sitting in the wreckage of it, I guess is the way to put it." The fire cracked. A piece of wood shifted. "What happened to him?" she asked, though she thought she already knew. "He pulled through," Maddox said. "Eventually. He's in Millhaven now with his family. But it took a long time." He looked at the papers on the ground between them. "I decided someone needed to pay attention to what Briggs was doing. Nobody else seemed to be." Evelyn thought about her own father. Not in his final months, but earlier, when he was still strong, when the land was still a challenge and not a burden. He'd been the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard enough and played it straight, things evened out in the end. She didn't know anymore if that was wisdom or just the story people told themselves to get through the day. "All right," she said. "So what do we do? We can't go to Dunmore and gather the other families at the same time." "But c'est possible, maman." "No," he agreed. "So we split the work." She raised an eyebrow. "I know where to find 2 of the Cutter's Pass families, the Brennans and a widow named Sola Vasquez, who is, from what I understand, extremely angry about what happened to her property and has been for about 2 years." Something in his expression shifted, something that might have been appreciation. "Anger that's been sitting that long is useful. I can ride to Cutter's Pass, talk talk to them, get their documents if they still have them. And I go to Dunmore, she said. You go to Dunmore. File with the Land Commissioner's office. The man's name is Aldous Reese. He's been in the position since January, and as far as I can determine, he has no relationship with the syndicate. Present the interest rate discrepancy. Ask for a preliminary freeze on the property transfer pending review. He looked at her. You'll need to be persuasive. I can be persuasive. I don't doubt it, he said, without any particular drama. But Briggs's people will find out quickly. There'll probably be a man in the commissioner's office or someone who reports to one. So go in, make your filing, and get out the same day if you can. She thought about riding 40 miles alone to make a legal filing in a city she'd been to twice in her life, in an office she'd never visited, arguing a case built on documents she'd barely had time to organize, against a syndicate that had lawyers and relationships and a head start of 11 months. Fine, she said. He almost smiled again. That almost smile was becoming familiar. You're not going to argue about it? Would arguing change anything? No. Then I don't see the point. She started carefully reordering the papers. I'll leave at first light. You? Same. They sat with the fire for a while after that, not talking. She wasn't sure when the silence stopped feeling like two strangers sitting near each other and started feeling like something else. Something more like two people who had, without quite deciding to, ended up pointed in the same direction. She didn't examine that too closely. There wasn't time. She made Dunmore City in a day and 3/4, pushing her horse harder than she liked and stopping shorter than she needed. The city was larger than she remembered, or maybe she was smaller than she'd been the last time she was here, which was possible in ways that had nothing to do with her physical size. She found a boarding house 2 streets from the Territorial Land Office and paid for a room and a bath and sat on the edge of the bed afterward with wet hair and her papers spread around her, going over the argument one more time. The interest rate was the foundation. She was sure of that. Everything else, the impossible benchmarks, the hidden water rights clause, the pressure tactics, was supporting structure, but the rate was where the legal violation was clearest. She wrote out a summary in her neatest hand and then read it over and rewrote 3 sentences that sounded too emotional. Not because she wasn't emotional, but because she understood the difference between what she felt and what would be useful to put in front of a government official. She slept badly and was at the commissioner's office when it opened. Aldous Reese was a compact man in his mid-40s with the manner of someone who had worked in enough bureaucracies to be perpetually unsurprised, but who retained, underneath that, an actual functional conscience. This was her read on him, anyway, developed in the first 4 minutes of their meeting. She'd been wrong about people before. She paid attention. She laid out her case methodically. The original mortgage terms, the acquisition by the Consolidated Range Syndicate, the transferred rate and the statutory cap, the management contract and its impossible benchmarks, the formal transfer that had been executed that morning, 2 days ago. Reese listened without interrupting, which was either a good sign or the practiced patience of a man about to tell her she had no case. When she finished, he picked up the mortgage document and studied it for a moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Not suspicious, just precise. "It was in my father's papers. He kept all his financial records. The original, not a copy. The original." He set it down and looked at the syndicate's transfer document beside it. He was quiet for long enough that she had to resist the urge to fill the silence. "The rate discrepancy is significant," he said finally. "It's 3 times the statutory limit," she said. "I've checked the territorial lending statutes." "You have," he said. A small pause. "This is not the first filing I've received concerning the Consolidated Range Syndicate's practices." She went still. "It isn't. I've had 2 correspondence inquiries from individuals in the Garnet Valley area in the past month. I haven't had anyone come in person with primary documentation." He tapped the mortgage note. "This matters. The rate violation, if it holds under review, would invalidate the debt instrument, which invalidates the management contract, which would make the transfer void, yes." He leaned back slightly. "I can issue a preliminary hold on the asset transfer pending review. That gives the formal process time to move." "How long does the review take?" "Ideally, 60 days. Practically, it depends on what Briggs's legal people do in response, which..." He looked at her with the expression of a man delivering news he considers it his duty to deliver accurately. They will respond quickly. These operations don't get built without knowing how to navigate challenge filings. I understand. The hold buys time, Miss Cross. It doesn't guarantee an outcome. It's more than I had yesterday, she said. He looked at her for a moment. That measuring look again, the kind she was getting used to from people who hadn't expected her to show up with documents and a clear argument. She didn't find it flattering. She found it a little tiresome. But she held his gaze and he picked up his pen. I'll issue the preliminary hold today, he said. You'll need to leave me the original documents. I'll have copies made and the originals returned to you within the week. To what address? Aldermore, she said. The Sandhill Inn, care of Margaret Hollis. He wrote it down. You should know that once this is filed, it becomes part of the public record. Briggs will know about it. He'll know about it anyway, she said. I'm counting on it. Reese's pen paused slightly. He glanced up. His next move will be to apply pressure somewhere, she said. On you, on the process, on me. It'll tell us something about where his real vulnerabilities are. He was quiet for a moment. Then he wrote something, stamped a form, and slid a copy across to her. I'll be in touch within 10 days, he said. She was back in Aldermore by nightfall of the following day, saddle sore and running on stale biscuits, and the specific grim determination of someone who has done the thing they set out to do and is waiting to find out if it was enough. Margaret Hollis took one look at her and put a plate of food in front of her before she'd gotten her coat off. Maddox arrived 3 hours later. He came into the inn with trail dust in his coat and the look of a man who had ridden hard and found what he was looking for, which was a particular kind of satisfaction that doesn't require announcement. He sat across from her at the corner table and ate half the bread that was left from her dinner, and she let him because she'd gotten what she needed from Reese's office, and she was in a sufficiently decent mood to be generous. The Brennans have their papers, he said. Both copies. Ada Brennan kept everything. She's the kind of woman who keeps everything, which in this case is extremely fortunate. The rate on their transfer was 22%, even worse than yours. And Sola Vasquez? A pause. Sola Vasquez, he said, does not have her papers. Syndicate's men took them when they cleared her place. But she has a memory like a courthouse ledger, and she is... He seemed to search for the word. Motivated. Will she testify to what she remembers? She will testify to that, and probably several additional things nobody asked her about, he said. She's been sitting on this for 2 years. She was waiting for someone to show up and ask. Evelyn thought about that. About a woman she didn't know, somewhere in Cutter's Pass, carrying 2 years of fury and nowhere to put it. What about the others? You said there were families in the Garnet Valley area. I got names, he said. I didn't have time to write out there, but Reese filing the hold will put some pressure on the timeline. If Briggs knows the commissioner's office is looking at the interest rate structure, he may move to consolidate his position, which means trying to finalize asset transfers faster and quietly, before a review locks them. So we need the other families quickly. Yeah. She reached into her coat and slid the copy of Reese's filing across the table. He looked at it, and this time the almost smile was more real than usual, which on his face amounted to something another person might call actual happiness. You got the hold, he said. I got the hold. He looked at the document for another moment. He moved fast. He said there had been other inquiries. I think we're not the first people to notice, just the first to show up with the original documents. That's the thing Briggs didn't count on, Maddox said, half to himself. He assumed when he took the papers along with the property, there was nothing left to fight with. He forgot that some people keep copies, she said, and that some people remember. He set the document down and looked at her directly, which he did sometimes in a way that she'd stopped finding disconcerting and started just accepting as the way he was, someone who looked at things he needed to understand without being self-conscious about it. How'd it go in the office? He asked. Reese, was he straight with you? As far as I can tell. He didn't promise anything he couldn't deliver. He told me Briggs's lawyers would push back fast. She paused. He was a little surprised I came in prepared. Most people don't. Most people don't know they can, she said. Most people assume the process isn't for them, that it's a system that works on their behalf in theory and against them in practice, and showing up to argue is a waste of time. And you don't assume that. I assumed it for about 3 days, she said. Then I decided I couldn't afford to. He was quiet for a moment. Down the bar, Margaret Hollis was pretending to clean something she'd already cleaned. The inn was otherwise empty at this hour, just the two of them in the corner, the papers between them, the lamp turning everything amber. There's something else, Maddox said. His voice dropped a fraction, not to secrecy, just to precision. Go ahead. On the ride back from Cutter's Pass, I cut through the south edge of the old Hargreave property. That's land the syndicate took about 18 months ago. They've got a structure out there I don't think is marked on any public filing. New building, good size, looked like a records facility. Filing cabinets visible through the window, guarded by 2 men who had no reason to be guarding a ranch outbuilding unless whatever was inside was worth guarding. She looked at him. Records, she said. That's what it looked like. They're records, she said, meaning all the contracts, all the transfer documents, every deal they've made in this territory. That's what I'm thinking. The implications of that settled over the table like something solid. If the syndicate kept centralized records, and an operation this organized almost certainly did, because organized operations required documentation to function, those records would contain every fraudulent deal they'd run, every inflated interest rate, every impossible benchmark, every family they'd stripped of land through the same mechanism they'd used on the Crosses and the Brennans and Sola Vasquez and whoever else hadn't been counted yet. That wasn't a filing at the commissioner's office. That was evidence of a territorial scale fraud. We can't just take them, she said. No, he agreed. That's theft. Everything we brought out of the evidence that way would be tainted. But if we could get someone with legal authority to compel access, Reese, Maddox said, with the preliminary hold in place, he has grounds to request a records audit. She nodded slowly. We need to tell him. We need to tell him with enough specificity that he can act on it, which means I need to go back and get a more precise location and some better detail on what's in that building. He paused. And that means going back onto syndicate-claimed land. They know your face, she said. They know my face at the front door, he said. I don't tend to use the front door. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something she wanted to say, something about the fact that he was doing this for Garrett Finch, who was his cousin, and for 3 families in Cutter's Pass he barely knew, and now for her, and that none of it was his legal obligation or his financial concern, and that she didn't quite understand it and suspected she probably should before too long. But that wasn't the conversation to have tonight. Be careful, she said instead. It came out slightly less impersonal than she intended. He noticed. She could tell he noticed, the same way she could tell most things about him now. Not because he was easy to read, but because she'd started paying attention to the small signals. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in it that was warmer than his usual measured directness, and neither of them said anything about it. You should sleep, he said. You've been on a horse for 3 days. So have you. I'm used to it. So am I, she said. That wasn't entirely true, and they both probably knew it. But she didn't move, and he didn't either, and for a little while they sat across from each other in the amber light, with the papers and the filing and the shape of something that wasn't yet a plan but was getting closer. And outside in the dark, the town of Aldermore went on being itself, quiet on the surface, and underneath it, starting to shift. Maddox was gone 2 days. Evelyn didn't ask where he'd slept or how close he'd gotten to the syndicate's men on the Hargreave property. When he walked back into the Sand Hill Inn on the morning of the 2nd day with a cut along his jaw that hadn't been there before and mud on his boots that was a different color from the mud around Aldermore, she handed him coffee and waited. He drank half of it standing up. It's a records building, he said. Not a guess anymore. I got close enough to see inside through a gap in the south wall. Filing cabinets, 4 of them, full. A desk with ledgers stacked on it, and a strongbox bolted to the floor that's the kind you use when you want something to survive a fire. He sat down. There are 2 guards during the day and 1 at night, and the night man is lazy. He spends most of his shift on the north side where there's a lean-to and he can get out of the wind. Did they see you? He touched the cut on his jaw briefly. One of the day men came around a corner faster than I expected. I got into the brush before he saw my face. The cut is from the brush. A pause. I don't think he knew what he heard, but they'll be more careful for a few days. She sat with that. So we can't go back immediately. No. Which works in our favor, actually, because what I saw gives Reese enough specificity to file for a records audit. We send him what we know. Location, description, the fact that it's on former Hargreave land that the syndicate holds. He can move on it through official channels, which means whatever's in that building comes out clean, usable. How long does an audit order take? Reese is the commissioner. He issues the order. The territorial marshal serves it. Days, not weeks, if he moves fast. He finished the coffee. The problem is the auction. She looked at him. He'd heard about it in Cutter's Pass, he explained, and confirmed it on the ride back. Briggs had scheduled a major regional cattle auction for the following Saturday at the Aldermore Stockyards. A genuine event, 300 or 400 ranchers expected, buyers coming in from as far as Millhaven and the Eastern Territories. It was the kind of gathering that happened twice a year at most, and it was not coincidentally exactly the kind of event at which the syndicate routinely formalized land acquisitions. New contracts signed, transfers recorded, deals made in the margins of the auction floor where the noise covered the conversation. He's going to move fast on everything he has pending, Maddox said. Any transfers that aren't finalized yet, he'll push them through at the auction. Once those are recorded at the auction registry and witnessed, the hold from Reese's office gets complicated to enforce because the witnesses are real and the registry is legitimate. So the preliminary hold covers your property specifically. The others, the families in Garnet Valley, anyone else he has pending contracts with, they're not covered yet. And if those transfers go through at the auction before Reese can extend the review, those families lose their standing. She understood the shape of it now. The records building was the full picture. Proof of the pattern, proof of the scheme across every family the syndicate had taken. But accessing it required Reese's audit order, which required time, which Briggs was about to eliminate by pushing everything through the auction in 4 days. He knows, she said, about the filing. He knows something moved, Maddox said. He might not know specifically about the interest rate argument, but someone at the commissioner's office talked. He's accelerating his timeline. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood for a moment. It was the kind of problem where every solution had a cost attached to it, and you had to decide which cost you could live with. We can't wait for the audit order, she said. That's where I land too. So we go to the auction. He was quiet. Not to take anything, she said quickly. Not to steal the records. But if those documents are going to be moved or destroyed once Briggs knows an audit is coming, and he'll know the moment Reese files the order, then we need to be there at the auction with people. With people, he repeated. Ada Brennan, she said. Sola Vasquez. Anyone else you found in Cutter's Pass who has a grievance and can ride. If the families who've been taken by this syndicate show up at that auction together, with their documents, in front of 300 or 400 ranchers who are Briggs's current and future business partners, and they make the argument publicly, he can't make it disappear quietly. Maddox looked at her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one where he was running the calculation on something and wasn't entirely happy with the result, but couldn't find a better answer. That's not a legal strategy, he said. That's a confrontation. It's both, she said. The legal argument is still the foundation, but legal arguments take months, and Briggs is going to spend those months moving assets and buying silence and making the evidence harder to find. A public confrontation with documentation in front of people who do business with him is something he can't lawyer his way out of in an afternoon. He has armed men, Maddox said. Cordell, the big one from your house, at least 4 or 5 others. At an auction with that many people, in that much noise, if things go wrong, they go wrong fast. I know, she said. You're not worried about that. I'm extremely worried about that, she said. But I'm more worried about what happens to those other families if we wait. He sat back. He rubbed the side of his face. Not the cut, the other side. The absent gesture of a man who is tired and thinking at the same time. She waited. I need to send word to Ada Brennan, he said finally. And Sola. If they're coming, they need time to ride. Can you get messages to them in 2 days? If I leave tonight? Then leave tonight, she said. He left before dark. riding west toward Cutter's Pass with 2 letters in his coat, one to Ada Brennan and one to Sola Vasquez, both written in Evelyn's hand because she had clearer penmanship and because writing them gave her something to do besides sit with the dread of what Saturday might bring. She spent the next day doing 3 things. First, she wrote a detailed letter to Aldous Reese in Dunmore City, describing the records building on the Hargreave property with as much specificity as Maddox had given her. Location, dimensions, what was visible through the gap in the south wall, the strongbox, the ledgers. She asked him to issue the audit order immediately and to have the territorial marshal serve it no later than Friday, before the auction. She sent it on the morning stage. Second, she went to see Marcus Webb. The feed store was quiet mid-morning, just Webb behind the counter, moving inventory with the methodical unhappiness of a man who'd been in the same 4 walls long enough that he'd memorized every imperfection in them. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the thing she'd seen from people in this town over and over. That slight contraction of guilt that people wear when they've done something they know is wrong and haven't yet been called on it. She didn't ease into it. "You've known Briggs's operation was crooked for at least a year," she said. "Probably longer." He set down the sack he was holding. "Evelyn, I'm not here to argue about it," she said. "I know why people didn't speak up. He controls too much. Crossing him feels like losing the fight before it starts." She looked at him steadily. "But I need to know. The Hargreave family. When they lost their place 18 months ago, was there anything wrong with how it went?" Webb was quiet for a long time. "Walt Hargreave came to me after," he said, finally. "Said the terms they'd given him were different from what he'd originally agreed to. Said he'd tried to read the contract before he signed, but Briggs's man was pressure, you know. Friendly pressure, but pressure." He picked the sack back up, set it back down. He couldn't find anything to do with his hands. "I told him to write to the Territorial Land Office. He did. Never heard back." "The man who was in the office before Reese," Evelyn said. Webb looked at her. "The previous land commissioner," she said. "He had a relationship with the syndicate. Reese is new. He's different." She paused. "The Hargreaves, do you know where they went?" "North somewhere. I heard Walt found work on a rail crew." She filed that away. "Third thing. The auction is Saturday," she said. "There are families coming who went through exactly what I went through. They're going to make the case publicly, in front of every rancher in the region, with documentation that shows what the syndicate has been doing." She held his gaze. "I'd like you to be there. Not to say anything dramatic. Just to be there and to be someone that people in this town trust, so that when they hear what's being said, they don't dismiss it as the complaint of a desperate woman." He was quiet for a moment, his jaw worked. "If Briggs finds out I'm involved—" "You're not involved in anything illegal," she said. "You're attending a public auction and listening to people speak." She let that sit. "Marcus, you knew my father for 20 years. That landed. She saw it land. She hadn't wanted to use it that way, but she wasn't in a position to be too proud about her methods right now." "I'll be there," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Oit. Maddox got back Friday evening, later than she'd expected, and he had 2 people with him. She'd imagined Ada Brennan as a composed, document-keeping type, organized, efficient, brisk. The reality was a stout woman in her late 50s with iron gray hair pinned severely back and an expression that suggested she had spent 2 years being quietly furious and was relieved to have somewhere to put it. She walked into the Sandhill Inn like she already knew where everything was, and pulled out a leather satchel and put it on the table without being asked. "Every paper I have," she said to Evelyn without preamble. "Mortgage note, transfer document, the management contract, 12 months of payment records, and 2 letters from Cordell that I think are essentially threatening if you read them carefully enough." She sat down. "My husband thinks I should have stayed home. I told him if he wanted the farm back, he should trust me to handle it." "Did he argue?" Evelyn asked. "He drove me to the road and told me to be careful, which is how John Brennan says I'm right." She folded her hands. "What's the plan?" Sola Vasquez was not what Evelyn expected either, though in the opposite direction. She was maybe 35, dark-eyed, small in frame, but with a quality of attention that made her seem larger in a room. The kind of presence that doesn't announce itself, but that you become aware of gradually. the way you become aware of a fire's heat from across a room. She had no documents. She'd told Maddox in Cutter's Pass, and she repeated it now. The syndicate's men had taken everything when they cleared her property. "What do you have?" Evelyn asked. "I have what I remember," Sola said. "The original rate I agreed to. The rate they changed it to. Every number they put in front of me. Every name. The date they came. The name of the man who came. What he said. And what the paper said. Which were two different things." She looked at Evelyn without any self-consciousness. "I kept a journal. They didn't take that because they didn't know it existed." "A journal is testimony," Maddox said from the end of the table. "It's dated, consistent, written contemporaneously. That matters." "I know it matters," Sola said. "I've been waiting for someone to come along who also knew it." The four of them sat around the corner table in the Sand Hill Inn with all the papers spread between them, and Margaret Hollis brought coffee and then went to the far end of the bar and found things to clean that didn't need cleaning and didn't ask any questions, which was the most useful possible thing she could have done. They went through those documents together, cross-referencing the numbers. Ada Brennan's transfer rate was 22%. Evelyn's was 19.5%. Sola's, from memory and journal, was 18%. All of them well past the statutory cap. All of them through the same structure. Debt acquired, impossible contract, transfer executed. "It's the same template," Ada said. She said it flatly, the way you say something you already knew and are simply confirming. "They didn't even change the language much. This paragraph here," she pointed to a section of her contract, then to the same section in Evelyn's. "Word for word." "That's what we present tomorrow," Evelyn said. "Not just one family's complaint. 3 families, 3 separate properties, the same fraudulent structure applied each time." "In front of how many people?" Sola asked. 400, Maddox said. "Ranchers, buyers, land agents, people who do business with Briggs or are considering it." Sola's expression didn't change, but something in it sharpened. "Good," she said simply. "It won't be peaceful," Maddox said. He wasn't looking at anyone specifically, but he was making sure they all heard. "Briggs has armed men there. When we stand up, they're going to move. I'll be positioned where I can intervene if it comes to that, but I can't make guarantees about how this goes." "None of us are asking for guarantees," Ada said. "His headman is Cordell," Evelyn said. "He's not violent by instinct. He's a paperman who happens to have violent men working for him. If the crowd turns against the syndicate, I think Cordell folds. The others—" She paused. "I don't know. I know Cordell," Sola said. Everyone looked at her. "He came to my property himself the day they cleared it. He's not a coward, but he's also not a true believer. He works for Briggs because Briggs pays well. If Briggs's position becomes untenable," she shrugged, one short, sharp movement, "he'll calculate his own interests. Then we need to make Briggs's position untenable fast," Evelyn said. They were quiet for a moment, all 4 of them looking at the papers. "There's one more thing," Maddox said. He reached into his coat and put a piece of paper on the table. It was a telegram, sent from Dunmore City that afternoon. Reese's name was on it. She picked it up and read it. Then she read it again. "Audit order issued this date. Marshal Hendricks serving Friday evening. Records to be secured pending review. Advise caution Saturday. A.R." She set it down. The audit order was real. Reese had moved. By tonight, a territorial marshal would be at the Hargreave property with legal authority to secure every document in that building, every contract, every ledger, every record of every deal the Consolidated Range Syndicate had made in this territory. Before the auction even began, the full evidence of what Briggs had done would be in official custody. "He doesn't know yet," she said. "He'll know in the morning," Maddox said, "when his men at the Hargreave property report in. So by the time the auction starts, he'll know the records are gone. He'll know the commissioner's office is involved, and he'll be trying to decide whether to run or push through." He looked at her. "That's the moment we have to be ready for. When a man realizes his position is collapsing and decides he has nothing left to lose, that's when he's most dangerous." Evelyn thought about Briggs's face on the street outside the inn. That measured ease, the world waits for me quality. She thought about what that face would look like when the ease was gone. She didn't let herself be frightened by the answer. There wasn't room for it. "All right," she said. "We go in the morning." She gathered the papers back into their respective satchels and pushed back from the table and stood up, and she looked at the three people across from her. Ada Brennan, with her iron gray hair and her organized fury. Sola Vasquez, watching the room the way a person watches a room when they've learned that rooms can turn on you. Maddox, with the cut still healing along his jaw, and that steady, particular quality of attention that she'd stopped finding unnerving and started finding, somewhere along the way, genuinely steadying. None of them were what anyone would call a powerful force. Two women who'd lost their land and a man who'd come looking for justice on behalf of a broken cousin and somewhere in the process collected a cause larger than he'd started with. No lawyers, no political allies, no money. What they had was documented truth and a room full of ranchers who didn't know yet that the man they were doing business with had been running the same scheme on their neighbors for 4 years. That would have to be enough. She went upstairs and lay down on the bed in her room at the Sandhill Inn with her boots still on and her hands folded on her chest and stared at the ceiling until somewhere around midnight when she finally, unexpectedly, fell asleep. Not peacefully, not easily, but the hard sleep of someone who has run out of useful things to worry about and has defaulted to the only thing the body knows how to do when it's completely used up. Outside, the town was quiet. Somewhere west of Aldermore, a territorial marshal was riding toward the Hargreave property with a court order in his coat. And in the morning, there would be an auction. The auction grounds were already loud by 8 in the morning. Evelyn heard it before she saw it. The layered noise of several hundred people and several thousand cattle compressed into the stockyard complex at the south end of Aldermore. The animals and the humans making roughly equal amounts of noise for entirely different reasons. She'd been to this auction twice with her father, years back, and she remembered it as an overwhelming thing. The press of bodies, the smell, the way sound bounced off the wooden pens and came back at you from directions you didn't expect. It was the same now, but she was looking at it differently. She was looking at it as a room she needed to work. She, Ada, and Sola arrived together on foot, their documents in a single satchel that Ada carried with both hands, and the focused attention of someone transporting something irreplaceable, which was exactly what she was doing. Maddox had gone ahead an hour earlier. He'd told her he'd be positioned near the main platform, and when she scanned the crowd, she found him after a moment, standing against the far fence line with his hat down and his arms folded, watching the crowd the way he watched everything, that steady cataloging attention that she'd come to think of as his particular form of readiness. He saw her, a small nod. She looked away and kept moving. Briggs was near the main platform with Cordell at his shoulder and two other men close enough to be deliberate. He looked from 30 feet away exactly like he always looked, controlled, unhurried, wearing his authority the way he wore his good coat as something that fit him and required no effort. But she watched his eyes move across the crowd in a way that didn't match the rest of his posture. He was checking faces. He was looking for something. He'd gotten the news from the Hargreave property. She was sure of it. He knows about the marshal, she said quietly to Ada, who was beside her. Does that change the plan? Ada asked. No, Evelyn said. It means he's going to try to move faster, which means we do too. The auction was structured in 2 halves, livestock trading in the morning, with the land and contract business conducted after the midday break, when the serious buyers settled in and the ones who'd just come for the cattle started drifting home. Briggs's transfers and new contracts would come in that second half. That was when he'd have the audience he needed to make everything look legitimate, witnessed, recorded. That was also when she needed to speak. The morning moved slowly. She stayed in the crowd, not hiding but not announcing herself either, circling through the edges of conversations, listening. The ranchers here were a cross-section of the territory. Some established, some struggling, a few with the look of men who'd recently lost acreage and were here partly for business and partly because they didn't know where else to go. She heard Briggs's name mentioned 3 times in the first hour, always in the tone people use for powerful things they've decided to accept as permanent features of their landscape. She found Marcus Webb near the East Pens at about 10 o'clock. He had his hands in his coat pockets and the expression of a man who was regretting a decision but not reversing it. I brought 2 others, he said quietly when she got close. Lon Purcell, he runs the hardware, and Walt Hargreave. She stopped. Hargreave is here? I thought he went north. Came back when he heard something was happening. Webb's jaw was tight. His brother is still in the territory. They've been in contact. He paused. He wants to talk to you. Walt Hargreave was a thin man, older than she'd expected, with the weathered stillness of someone who'd spent a long time being angry with nowhere to put it and had finally found somewhere. He shook her hand with a grip that was careful, almost formal. "You're the cross girl," he said. "Woman?" she said, out of habit. He looked at her for a moment and something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "Your father was a straight man," he said. "Thomas Cross. I knew him some." "I know," she said. "He thought well of you." That landed. She watched him absorb it. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "I need you to stand where people can see you when I speak," she said. "That's all. Just stand there and be Walt Hargreave, who people in this territory remember. When they hear what I'm saying about the syndicate, I want them to look over and see you, and I want them to make the connection themselves." He nodded once. "I can do that." The midday break came and went. The crowd thinned slightly and then resettled, the way crowds do when a gathering shifts from its first purpose to its second. The platform at the center of the grounds was where the auctioneer ran the livestock sales from, and it was where the land agents and syndicate representatives set up for the afternoon session, a long table with chairs, papers, the apparatus of formal transaction. Briggs took his place at the table. Cordell sat to his right. Three other men Evelyn didn't know by name, but recognized from Briggs's operation, took positions around the perimeter. Not at the table, standing, their eyes on the crowd rather than on the platform. She read that immediately for what it was. The session opened with routine business: a water rights transfer, 2 grazing lease renewals, a small property sale that had nothing to do with the syndicate. She stood in the middle of the crowd and felt her heartbeat in a way that was inconvenient but not surprising, and she breathed through it and watched Briggs at the table and waited. He opened the first syndicate transfer at 1:30. A family name she didn't recognize: Pollard, 40 acres in the Garnet Valley. The same mechanism she knew by heart now. Debt acquired, contract signed, benchmarks missed, transfer executed. The Pollard family wasn't here. There was no one at this auction to object. She stepped forward. It was not a dramatic movement. She didn't push through the crowd or announce herself loudly. She simply moved forward and stepped up onto the platform in the gap between 2 men who were too surprised to react immediately, and she turned to face the crowd and said, in a voice that was larger than she'd expected to find in herself at that particular moment, "I need to speak." The noise didn't stop immediately. It reduced, the way a room's noise reduces when something unexpected happens and people need a second to register it. Briggs looked at her from across the table, and his face went through something fast and controlled before settling back into its usual composed surface. "Miss Cross," he said, "this is not the appropriate—" "My name is Evelyn Cross," she said, to the crowd rather than to him. "My family had 200 acres 11 miles north of here for 15 years. 3 weeks ago, the Consolidated Range Syndicate took it through a debt transfer and a management contract that contained an illegal interest rate, 3 times the territorial statutory limit." She held up the papers, not waving them, not performing, just making them visible. "I have the documentation. I have the original mortgage note and the syndicate's transfer document side by side. You can read the numbers yourself." "Boss Saishto Bamdayasen." One of Briggs's perimeter men started moving toward the platform. He stopped because Colt Maddox had moved too, and was now standing between that man and the platform, not touching him, not threatening him explicitly, just standing there in that particular way that communicated very clearly that stopping was the correct decision. The man stopped. "The Consolidated Range Syndicate has used the same scheme on at least 3 families I can prove," Evelyn continued. "The same contract language, the same impossible benchmarks, the same fraudulent interest rates. Mrs. Ada Brennan of Cutter's Pass." Ada stepped forward from the crowd, satchel in hand, chin up. "Her family lost 45 acres 14 months ago. The rate applied to her debt transfer was 22%. The territorial cap is 10. She paused. "Sola Vasquez, also of Cutter's Pass, lost her property 2 years ago. The Hargreave family." She found Walt Hargreave in the crowd. He was standing where she'd asked him to stand, visible, unmistakable. "The Hargreave family lost 80 acres 18 months ago through the same mechanism. The crowd was quiet now, in the particular way of several hundred people all deciding simultaneously to pay attention to one thing. Briggs pushed back his chair and stood up. These are irresponsible accusations from a woman with a personal grievance. My personal grievance is that your organization violated the territorial lending statute, she said, and her voice stayed level, which cost her something, but she didn't show it. That's not an emotional argument, that's a statutory one. And as of yesterday evening, the Territorial Land Commissioner's Office has issued an audit order on your records facility on the former Hargreave property, which a territorial marshal has already secured. She looked at him directly. Whatever's in those ledgers is in official custody now. The silence that followed that was a different quality from the silence before. It had weight to it. She watched Briggs's face. The composed surface was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. A recalculation happening at speed behind his pale eyes. He was not a man who panicked. She'd understood that about him from the beginning. But he was also a man whose entire operation depended on operating in spaces where no one was paying close attention, and that condition had just ended. He looked at Cordell. Cordell was looking at the crowd. The crowd was looking at Briggs. This woman has no authority here, Briggs said, but the register of his voice had changed. Less easy, more effortful. Whatever filing she's made with the commissioner's office will be addressed through the appropriate legal process. In the meantime, this auction is a legitimate commercial. How many of you, Evelyn said, cutting across him, have signed a provisional contract with the Consolidated Range Syndicate in the last 3 years? 6 hands went up in the crowd, then 2 more, slower, from men who'd looked around first to see who else was raising theirs. 8 families, 8 pending contracts, some of them probably already in default by design, all of them sitting on the same impossible benchmark structure, waiting for the same outcome. I'd like you to look at your contracts, she said, specifically the interest rate and the debt transfer provision. And then I'd like someone to tell me if any of you were shown the territorial lending statute before you signed. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a man near the back, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, the kind of face you'd trust on sight, said, "What's the rate limit?" 10% per annum, she said. On private debt transfers. He reached into his coat and pulled out folded papers and looked at them. His face changed. Mine says 6T, he said. Someone else. 14.5. Another voice, younger. 20. The crowd noise rebuilt itself, but it was different now. Not the ambient noise of commerce, but the sharper, directed sound of people talking to each other with something specific to say. She could feel the shift in the room the way you feel a current change direction. Briggs said something to Cordell that she couldn't hear. Cordell's response was short, and his face was careful and controlled, but she could see him doing the same calculation Sola had predicted. The rational man running the numbers on a situation that was deteriorating and assessing his own position within it. One of the perimeter men made another move toward the platform. He stopped again, faster this time, because Maddox hadn't moved from where he was standing, and the perimeter man had apparently improved his assessment of how that would go. Marcus Webb pushed through the crowd to the platform. He climbed the step and stood beside Evelyn without announcing himself and crossed his arms, which was all he'd said he'd do. But Marcus Webb had been in Aldermore for 30 years, and half the ranchers in this crowd had bought feed from him at some point and knew his face. And the act of him standing there next to her said something he didn't need to put into words. Walt Hargreave walked forward until he was at the front of the crowd, clearly visible, and he looked at Briggs with an expression that was entirely quiet and entirely devastating. Briggs looked around the crowd once more. She watched him do it, watched him read the room the way powerful men read rooms when they're trying to determine whether they still control it. He didn't control it. He sat back down. Not a retreat. She could see him reframing it internally as a tactical choice. He put his hands flat on the table in front of him and looked at Cordell again. Cordell stood up. He stood in the particular way of a man who has decided to separate himself from a situation in the most official-seeming way possible. And he said, quietly enough that only the people near the table could hear, "I'm going to need to speak with our legal office in Dunmore before we proceed with any further transfers today." Briggs looked at him. "James?" Briggs said. Just his name. "The audit order changes our legal exposure on the pending contracts," Cordell said, and his voice was steady and impersonal and completely, deliberately devoid of anything that could be called loyalty. We'd be formalizing transfers under active commissioner review. That creates liability. He picked up his papers. I can't recommend proceeding. The silence at the table was different from the silence in the crowd. It was smaller and colder. Briggs sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up and buttoned his coat, one button at a time, with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who was performing composure for an audience, even when the audience had already seen behind it. He looked at Evelyn once, a long, flat look with nothing pleasant left in it. And then he stepped off the platform and walked toward the grounds exit, with two of his men behind him. He did not run. She had expected that. Men like Briggs didn't run. They withdrew. They went somewhere to regroup and call lawyers and decide what the next move was. He was not finished, and she knew it. But he was gone. The crowd held the moment for a second or two, the way crowds hold a breath, and then it broke open into noise. 50 conversations at once. Men with contracts in their hands. Ranchers turning to each other with the expressions of people who'd just been told that something they'd half suspected was actually true. Ada Brennan stepped up beside Evelyn and put the satchel down on the table and started laying out documents. Organized, systematic, clearly labeled, the way she'd been doing her whole life, and the way she'd been waiting to do for 14 months. Sola Vasquez moved through the crowd with her journal open, finding the men who'd raised their hands about their contract rates, speaking to them quietly, directly, without softening anything. Evelyn stood on the platform and breathed. Her legs were shaking slightly, which she hadn't noticed until now. She locked her knees and put one hand on the table's edge for something to lean against that wasn't visible as leaning. Maddox came through the crowd and stepped up beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the ground's exit where Briggs had gone, doing a slow visual check of where the remaining perimeter men were. Professional habit. She'd gotten used to it. Cordell, she said quietly. He's at the table. She looked. Cordell was still seated, talking to one of the ranchers with the contract rate discrepancy. And he was talking with the expression of a man who was trying very hard to be useful to someone other than Harlan Briggs. He'll cooperate, she said. Probably, Maddox agreed. He's been waiting for an exit. You just gave him one. She watched the crowd for a moment. 8 families with contract rate discrepancies. Dozens of conversations happening in the open air of the auction grounds. Marcus Webb talking to 3 ranchers she didn't know, pointing at something in a document. Walt Hargreaves shaking a man's hand, saying something that made the man's face go from uncertain to decided. He's going to fight the audit, she said. Briggs, he'll have lawyers in Reese's office by Monday. Yes, Maddox said, and the legal process is going to take months. Yes. And some of these families might not get their land back even then. He was quiet for a moment. Some of them might not, he said. That's true. She didn't say anything for a while. She watched Ada Brennan explain a statutory interest rate to a man 3 times her size, who was listening with the focused attention of someone hearing something important for the first time. She watched Sola Vasquez hand her journal to a rancher and point to a dated entry, and watched the rancher read it and look up and say something that made Sola nod once, short and certain. It's not enough, Evelyn said. What you did today, Maddox said. He finally looked at her. It's enough for the day. The rest is more days. She understood that. She wasn't sure she was satisfied by it, but she understood it. The afternoon light was going long across the stockyards, turning everything the color of old copper. Somewhere on the other side of the grounds, someone was still trying to sell cattle, because the world was practical that way. Disasters and revelations happening on one end of a room, while ordinary commerce continued on the other, because people still needed to eat and animals still needed to be sold, and life was not willing to pause for the drama of justice. Sheriff Holcroft arrived at 3:20, which told her 2 things. He'd heard what happened, and he'd waited long enough to determine which way the wind was blowing before he showed up. He was a compact man, cautious in the way of someone who'd spent years on the fence between 2 things and hadn't quite decided which side he was on. He walked up to Evelyn on the platform and looked at the documents Ada was still organizing. And then he looked at the crowd, and she watched him do the same calculation everyone else had been doing all afternoon. Commissioner's audit order, she said to him before he could speak. She held out Reese's telegram. Issued yesterday. Territorial Marshal has already secured the records facility. The Marshal's name is Hendricks, if you need to verify. Holcroft took the telegram and read it. His jaw moved slightly. Briggs, he said. He left, she said. About an hour ago. Another pause. He looked at the crowd again. There are going to be formal complaints filed through the commissioner's office, she said. At least 11 families that we know of. The records that Hendricks secured will corroborate most of them. She kept her voice even and factual. The legal process is going to move, Sheriff. The question for you is whether you're inside it or outside it. He was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet where you can see a man's history moving through him. Every choice that had kept him comfortable and every choice he'd avoided making, and the point at which he decided that the math had changed. I'm going to need statements, he said, from anyone with a direct complaint. Formal statements, signed. He handed the telegram back. Can you have them ready by Monday morning? She looked at Ada Brennan, who had heard all of this from 3 feet away and was already reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. We'll have them ready tonight, Ada said. Holcroft nodded once and stepped off the platform and walked back through the crowd, and people stepped aside for him with the particular respect of a man whose authority had just been re-established in a way that had nothing to do with Harlan Briggs. Evelyn let out a breath she'd been holding since approximately 8 that morning. Her hand was still on the table edge. She let go of it. Her legs had stopped shaking, which was a relief. Maddox was still beside her. He didn't say anything, which she appreciated because anything he said at that moment would have required her to respond, and she didn't have a response ready. She was just standing in the late afternoon light in the middle of a stockyard in a town that had watched her sign away everything she owned 8 days ago, and she was still here. And the man who'd taken it from her had just walked off the grounds without his next move in place, and the people around her were talking to each other and reading documents and not being afraid anymore. And she didn't know what exactly to call what she was feeling, not victory. Too soon. Too many months of legal process still ahead. Too many families whose outcomes were still uncertain. Not relief either. That wasn't quite it. Something more like the feeling after a storm when the wind drops and the air is clean and cold, and you can hear yourself think again. The damage was done, and the rebuilding was ahead, and the ground was wet and broken, but the storm had passed, and she was still standing on the ground, and that was, for right now, the thing that mattered. The statements took most of the night. Ada Brennan wrote in a steady, clear hand that didn't waver, regardless of the hour, which Evelyn had come to think of as the most accurate possible expression of Ada's character. A woman who'd been waiting to put something on record for 14 months and wasn't about to rush it now that she finally had the chance. Sola Vasquez dictated hers in precise, careful sentences that she corrected twice. Not because she'd misremembered, but because she wanted the language exact. Walt Hargreave wrote slowly and crossed out more than he kept. And when he was done, he looked at the page for a long time before he signed it, the way you look at something you know matters and want to make sure you've done it right. By midnight, there were 11 signed statements on the table at the Sand Hill Inn. Margaret Hollis had long since stopped pretending she wasn't listening and had pulled up a chair and was helping keep the papers in order, which was not something she'd been asked to do, and which nobody asked her to stop. Evelyn delivered them to Sheriff Holcroft's office at 7 the next morning. He was already there, which told her he'd also had a short night. He took the statements without comment and set them on his desk and looked at the stack of them for a moment. Then he said, Briggs left Aldermore last night, headed toward Dunmore, best I can determine. Running, she said. Relocating, Holcroft said, with the particular flatness of a man choosing his words carefully. Though the distinction may not hold, Marshal Hendricks has been in contact with the Commissioner's office about the records from the Hargreave property. I've been asked to cooperate with the territorial investigation, which I intend to do. She looked at him. I know what you're thinking, he said. I'm not thinking anything, she said. I'm listening. He looked at the statements again. I made certain choices over the past 2 years that I'd make differently now. That's the honest answer. He said it without self-pity, without asking for anything in return, which she found she could respect even if she wasn't ready to forgive it. What I can do going forward is make sure the formal process has what it needs from this office. That's what I need from you, she said. Nothing more. She walked back to the inn in the early morning quiet, and she thought about the things people do when they're afraid. The silence they choose, the accommodations they make, the ways they tell themselves that going along is different from participating. She thought about everyone who'd stood on the street when she signed that document and said nothing. She understood it. That didn't mean she'd ever fully stop being angry about it, but she understood it, and understanding it was what let her work with Holcroft instead of writing him off entirely. That, she'd come to believe, was the only way anything actually changed. Not by demanding that people be braver than they were, but by giving them a moment where bravery costs less than it had before and letting them choose it. The formal investigation moved faster than she'd expected and slower than she wanted, which was probably about right. Aldous Reese in Dunmore City turned out to be exactly what he'd seemed in their first meeting, a man with an actual conscience and the procedural authority to act on it, which was a rare enough combination that she didn't take it for granted. The records secured from the Hargreave property were exactly what Maddox had suspected, a complete archive of the syndicate's operations across 3 years and 4 territories. 47 separate transactions. 31 of them showed the same fraudulent interest rate structure. 19 involved the impossible benchmark contracts. The number, when Reese's office published the preliminary findings 6 weeks after the auction, landed in the territory like something dropped from a height. 47 families. Some gone, some scattered, some, like the Finch family in Millhaven, slowly rebuilding from nothing. 19 families still in the territory who had active claims on their former properties. Briggs was arrested in Dunmore City 3 weeks after the auction on charges that accumulated quickly once the records were in official hands: fraud, illegal lending, coercion, and a separate charge related to payments made to the previous land commissioner whose relationship with the syndicate had been documented in the ledgers in a way that was embarrassingly specific. His lawyers were good, expensive, and ultimately insufficient because the records didn't leave room for the kind of argument good, expensive lawyers usually make. You can argue interpretation. You can't argue arithmetic. Cordell cooperated with the investigation, completely, and apparently without being asked twice. Sola Vasquez had been right about him. He was a man who'd been working a calculation for years, and the moment the numbers shifted, he shifted with them. Evelyn didn't respect him for it, but she used it, because the information he had about the syndicate's internal structure helped the investigation reach the investors behind Briggs's operation, 2 men in the Eastern Territories who had been running similar schemes under different names for nearly a decade. She heard about the arrest from Maddox, who heard it from Reese's office through a contact she hadn't known he had until he mentioned it casually, the way he mentioned most things. 2 investors, he said, folded almost immediately once their names were connected to the territorial fraud charges. Their lawyers apparently advised them that the evidence was too complete to fight. Garrett's family, she said. Will they qualify for restitution? He was quiet for a moment. Probably partial. The restitution fund is built from the syndicate's liquidated assets, and there are 47 families ahead of them in line. A pause. But they'll get something. And the Cutter's Pass land, the Finch property. It was resold by the syndicate to a buyer who turns out to have known the provenance was questionable. Reese's office is pursuing that separately. She thought about Garrett Finch, who she'd never met, sitting in Millhaven with his wife and 2 kids, having spent 2 years in the wreckage of something that wasn't his fault. She thought about what getting a portion of your life back after losing all of it actually felt like. Not like victory, probably. More like finding a piece of something broken that you'd thought was gone entirely. It didn't make the break not have happened, but it was something. How is he, she asked. Garrett. Maddox looked at her. It was one of those moments where she could see him deciding how much to give. Better than he was, he said. His wife wrote me. She said he's been working and that he's been present, which is the word she used, present. He looked at the table. It's a small word for a hard thing. She didn't say anything to that. Some things don't need commentary. You just let them sit and mean what they mean. The Cross property was returned to her in the 8th week. The formal order came from Reese's office, citing the voided debt instrument and the consequent invalidity of the management contract and transfer. It was several pages of dense legal language that she read 3 times to make sure she understood it correctly. And when she was sure, she folded it and put it in the tin box with her father's papers and sat with it for a while. She'd expected to feel more. She wasn't sure what more would have looked like. Some clean, uncomplicated happiness, maybe. The kind that existed in the gap between what you fought for and what you actually felt when you got it. What she felt instead was complicated in the way real things are complicated. The land was hers again. Her father was still dead. The 14 months of debt and fear and watching the place deteriorate under the syndicate's management had happened and couldn't unhappen. She rode out to the homestead alone the morning after the order arrived. She didn't tell Maddox where she was going, not out of secrecy, but because this part felt like it needed to be private. The place had been used hard. The syndicate had run too many cattle through the south pasture, and the grass was thin and rutted, and the fence line along the creek bed had been let go, and someone had taken the good hinges off the barn door and replaced them with something cheap that didn't sit right. The house itself was intact, but emptied out. They'd taken everything that wasn't structural, including her mother's stove, which was going to require a conversation with Reese's office about asset recovery. She walked through every room. She stood in her father's bedroom for a while and didn't try to think about anything in particular. Then she went outside and looked at the land, the rocky southeast quarter, the dry summer grass, the creek bed catching morning light in the way it always had, indifferent and clean, not knowing or caring that it had spent 14 months being someone else's problem. It was hers. It wasn't perfect. It was going to take a season of real work to bring the pasture back, and she'd need to restock the cattle from almost nothing. And the fence line was going to cost her money she didn't quite have yet, and the stove situation was unresolved. She'd figure it out. That was not bravado. It was just a fact about her, one she'd arrived at somewhere in the process of the past 2 months. She was someone who figured things out when they needed to be figured out, not because she was exceptional, but because the alternative was giving up. And giving up wasn't something she'd ever found she was built for. Her father had been the same way. She used to think that was a cross-family stubbornness, something particular to them. She understood now it was just what survival looked like from the inside, not courage exactly, more like a refusal to let the worst possibility be the last word. She stayed for an hour. Then she rode back to Aldermore. Maddox was leaving on a Tuesday. She'd known it was coming in the way you know things that have been true since the beginning, but that you've been not quite looking at directly. He was not a man who stayed in one place. That wasn't a flaw. It was just a fact about him, the same way the rocky southeast quarter was a fact about her land. Some things were what they were. He told her over coffee at the Sandhill Inn, 3 days after the restitution orders went out to the qualifying families. He said it plainly, without preamble, which she'd come to expect from him. "I'm going to ride out to Mill Haven," he said. "See Garrett. Then there are 2 families in the Garnet Valley who are having trouble with the claims process. The paperwork is stalled somewhere and Reese's office hasn't responded. I want to make sure they don't fall through. They shouldn't have to rely on you riding to Mill Haven to get their paperwork moving," she said. "No," he agreed. "But they do. For now." She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "And after that?" "I don't know," he said. And she believed him because he didn't say things he didn't mean. There are other places where this kind of operation is running. Different names, same mechanics. Someone has to pay attention to it. "Someone," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not good at staying still," he said. Not an apology, just the honest accounting of a man describing himself accurately. "I know," she said. "You're going to be all right," he said. And that wasn't empty comfort either. It was an assessment, the same way he assessed terrain and weather and the credibility of men who moved their coats to show their weapons. He'd looked at her and concluded she was going to be all right. And she found she trusted his judgment on it. "I know that too," she said. They sat with the coffee for a while. She thought about the night they'd sat across from each other in this same corner with documents spread between them and the shape of something that wasn't a plan yet, and how far that felt from this morning and how quickly the distance had accumulated. 2 months. A whole different version of everything. "The families in the Garnet Valley," she said. "What are their names?" "Reyes and Gould," he said. She pulled a piece of paper from her coat. She'd taken to carrying paper and a pencil, a habit developed from 2 months of needing to write things down quickly. And she wrote the names and the nature of the problem as he described it, and she folded the paper and put it in her coat. "I'll write to Reese," she said. "He knows my name now. It might move faster." Maddox looked at her. "You're building something," he said. Not a question. "Someone has to," she said. "Reese's office is one man. The families coming out of this syndicate investigation are going to need help navigating the restitution process for months. Half of them have never dealt with the land commissioner's office. They don't know what they're entitled to or how to ask for it. That's not a small job, he said. No, she said, but it's the job that's there. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him running the calculation. Not about her capability. She'd stopped worrying about that particular calculation in other people's heads a while back. Something else. Something she let him get to on his own. I'll come back through, he said finally. In the fall, probably. There are things in this territory that aren't finished yet. There are, she agreed. She didn't make more of that than it was. She'd spent enough of the past 2 months doing the pragmatic thing that she'd gotten reasonably good at telling the difference between what was real and what she wanted to be real, and letting the first one take precedence without making herself smaller for it. Whatever was between her and Maddox was real. What shape it was eventually going to be, she didn't know, and she'd decided that not knowing was acceptable. She'd learned to live with uncertainty about much larger things. He left the next morning before full light. She was up. She was always up before sunrise. That hadn't changed. And she stood outside the inn, and they said goodbye with a handshake that turned into something slightly longer than a handshake, and they didn't say anything particularly significant, and that was fine, because the significant things had already been said across 2 months of hard work and bad coffee and documents spread on tables in lamplight. She watched him ride until the road bent, and then went inside and had breakfast and started the letter to Aldous Reese about the Reyes and Gould families. Ada Brennan came back to Aldermore in September. Her family's land hadn't been fully returned. The syndicate had resold their property to a legitimate buyer who'd made improvements, and the restitution calculation was complicated, and the lawyers were still working. Ada had accepted a partial settlement and was looking at a smaller parcel further east, cheaper but workable. She wasn't happy about it. She was also not broken by it, which Evelyn had come to understand were two very different things that people sometimes confused. She and Evelyn sat on the front step of the Sandhill Inn on a cool September afternoon, and Ada said, "I thought getting the land back was the whole thing. Now I'm not sure it was." Evelyn waited. "What I mean is," Ada stopped. She was not a woman who struggled to say things, so when she struggled, it meant the thing was real. "What I mean is, I was so focused on the injustice of what was taken that I didn't think about what I'd actually build with it if I got it back." She looked at the street. "The land was always a means to something. I forgot that somewhere along the way." "You didn't forget," Evelyn said. "You just had to fight for it so hard that the fighting became the point for a while. That happens." "Did it happen to you?" Evelyn thought about her father's land, the rocky southeast quarter, the dry grass, the fence line she was slowly repairing on her own with tools she'd borrowed from Marcus Webb and would pay back in labor when harvest came around. She thought about what she was building alongside it, the informal network of families she'd been corresponding with through Reese's office. The process guide she'd drafted for navigating restitution claims that Reese had asked her permission to distribute through the commissioner's office formally. "It happened to me," she said. "And then the fighting ended, and I had to figure out what I actually wanted." "What do you want?" Ada asked. Evelyn looked at the street. Aldermore in September was the same town it had always been. The general store, the feed barn, the barbershop, the telegraph office. Same buildings. Something in the texture of it was different, in the way that something in the texture of a face changes after a person has been through something hard and come out the other side. Not marked exactly, but different in a way you couldn't unsee once you knew it was there. "I want the ranch to work," she said. "I want the families coming out of this investigation to get what they're owed without having to fight for it alone. I want—" She paused. "I want there to be something in place so the next Briggs who comes through this territory finds it harder than the last one did. Not impossible. Hard." "That's a lot," Ada said. "It's enough to keep me busy," Evelyn said. Ada made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You sound like your father." Evelyn looked at her. She hadn't known Ada knew Thomas Cross. "He used to come through Cutter's Pass sometimes," Ada said. "For feed. We talked occasionally. He was—" She shook her head. "He was the kind of man who made things seem possible by being matter-of-fact about them. Not optimistic, just certain that the work was there to be done and that he was going to do it." Evelyn sat with that. She'd been grieving her father for over a year and a half, and grief was strange in that it could reach you from completely unexpected angles. Not when you expected it, not at the grave or in the empty rooms, but in a moment on a front step in September when someone described him in 2 sentences, and the description was exactly right, and you felt the loss of him sharpen and then soften at once. Because being known accurately is a form of survival. Thank you for that, she said. Her voice was level. She kept it level. He'd be proud of you, Ada said. Plainly, not sentimentally. The way you say something true. I know, Evelyn said. And she did know, which was perhaps the thing she was most certain of. More certain than the restitution process, more certain than the legal outcomes still working their way through the commissioner's office, more certain than anything she'd fought for in the past 2 months. Whatever else was uncertain, she knew what Thomas Cross would have thought of his daughter standing on a platform in a stockyard and making the argument that needed to be made. And the knowledge of it was not a comfort exactly, but it was a foundation, something solid under the uncertain ground of everything else. The last letter from Maddox came in late October, mailed from somewhere west of Millhaven. He wrote the way he spoke, plainly, without decoration, nothing in it that wasn't meant. Garrett was doing better. The Finch family had received a partial restitution payment and were looking at land in a valley 2 days' ride from Cutter's Pass. His wife had written to thank Evelyn, which he was passing along. The Garnet Valley families, Reyes and Gould, had gotten their claims unstuck after Evelyn's letter to Reese and were in the process of returning to their properties. He'd heard of a similar operation running in the Northern Territories. Different syndicate, same mechanics. He was going to look into it. He'd be back in the spring, he thought. There were things in this territory that weren't finished. She read the letter twice, then put it in the tin box with her father's papers and the restitution order and the copy of the commissioner's filing and everything else that had accumulated into the record of the past 8 months. The box was fuller than it used to be. She'd need a bigger one eventually. She went outside and looked at the land. The south pasture was coming back, slowly, imperfectly, nothing like what it had been yet, but coming. She'd put 24 cattle on it in late September, bought at a fair price from a rancher in the Garnet Valley who knew her name and had given her reasonable terms without being asked, because word moved in a territory and the word about Evelyn Cross had changed. The fence line along the creek was repaired. The barn door hinges were replaced. The stove situation had been resolved through a formal asset recovery order that had taken 6 weeks and 2 letters to Reese and 1 very pointed letter to the attorney overseeing the syndicate's liquidation. The house was the same house it had always been. Low, solidly built, cool in the morning and warm in the afternoon, every flaw in it known to her from childhood. She'd slept in it alone since she moved back, and she'd gotten used to the sounds it made at night, which were the same sounds it had always made, just heard differently now that she was the only one listening. She was not finished being lonely. She was not finished grieving. She was not finished worrying about whether the informal network of families she was trying to build would hold together without something more formal to anchor it, or whether the commissioner's office would keep prioritizing the restitution claims when the political pressure from the investigation faded, or whether the next man who rode into this territory with money and lawyers and impossible contracts would find the ground as ready for him as Briggs had found it. These were the things she carried. She didn't pretend she didn't carry them. But here's what she knew, and what she'd have told anyone willing to listen. Not as a lesson, because she didn't think life delivered lessons exactly, not in the clean way the word implied. More as the thing she'd worked out from the inside of a particular experience and believed to be true. The people who took from her had counted on her being alone. That was the whole mechanism. Isolate the debt, isolate the family, make the loss seem individual and shameful and private, something that happened to you specifically because you weren't strong enough or smart enough or connected enough to prevent it. The signature on the document, the empty yard, the crowd that watched in silence, all of it designed to make her feel like the only person this was happening to, because a person who feels alone doesn't look for allies and doesn't build the case and doesn't ride 40 miles to a government office with original documents and an argument. What broke the syndicate was not that she was exceptional. She was stubborn and frightened, and she made the argument with shaking legs on a platform in a stockyard. What broke it was that Ada Brennan had kept her papers, and Sola Vasquez had kept her journal, and Walt Hargreave had come back when he heard something was happening, and Marcus Webb had stood on a step beside her because he'd known her father for 20 years, and Aldous Reese was new to his office and hadn't yet decided that the way things were was the way they had to be. None of them had been brave in the spectacular way. They'd each just been willing to do the one specific thing they could do at the moment they could do it, and the sum of those specific things had been enough. That was what she wanted to build something around. Not a monument to what had happened, but a structure. Something practical and unglamorous and specific that made it a little harder for the next person to be made to feel alone before they'd even had the chance to look for help. The sun was going down over the ridge. The cattle were moving slow in the south pasture, in no particular hurry, which was the correct attitude for cattle to have. The creek was making its small sounds along the bottom of the property. She stood in the yard that had been her father's yard and would, she intended, be her yard for a very long time, and she breathed the October air and she thought about spring. Maddox would be back in spring. She'd have things to show him by then. She was already planning them. She went inside and lit the lamp and sat down at the table with a fresh piece of paper, and she began to write.